looking at inequality from an economic or business perspective, there's trade-offs. We call it the great equity versus efficiency trade-off. If you move towards a more equitable society, that implies lower GDP growth and overall lower size economic pie. If you opt for efficiency, that is a lower size government, lower taxes, then you have higher economic growth. I think there are clearly limits to that trade-off. If incomes become so unequal, there could be a negative feedback effect, and it could start actually affecting negatively GDP. I was going to focus the bulk of my remarks on what I think are some of the causes or possible causes for the changes of the income distribution that's occurred over the last 40 years. The Gini coefficient began to rise in the U.S. somewhere around the mid-1970s. It predated the Reagan Revolution, so whatever factors were going on with causing the skewing of the income distribution, it predated the Reagan years. I think maybe as long as by a decade. And I've got some basically a list of basically ideas or premises that I think might contribute to it. The first is a fundamental structural change in the economy from a manufacturing-based economy to a more service and high technology base. So the skill structure required for jobs fundamentally changed in the United States. And I think that has contributed to the skewing of the income distribution. Another a big one that I see is the healthcare cost. I think that's more of a factor than people realize. Healthcare costs consume about 17% of GDP today. They're expected within about 10 years to be 25% of GDP. And the escalation has not lessened. At all. In terms of the side effects of the healthcare crisis, or there's something like 50 million Americans in any given day that are uninsured. There's an unfunded mandate that's primarily composed of Medicare that's approaching $60 trillion. So the Medicare program is essentially broke. Within 10 years, we're going to have a major demographic crisis with the Medicare program, and it's a function of the escalating healthcare costs. And you see that the fringe benefit rate has doubled over the last 30 years, from 20% to over 40% today, and the bulk of that's driven by healthcare costs. There's a study that was come out a couple of years ago that showed that about 45,000 Americans die every year because of inadequate health care. There's kind of an interesting dual myth going on. The myth among conservatives in the United States is that there's no health care rationing in the United States. You should listen to them. And among the left, there's no health care rationing in Europe. And so we don't really have, from my perspective, an honest discussion about that. I think there's a culture of excess compensation in the United States. And it goes beyond just CEOs that we often read about in the paper. Many CEOs will make several $100 million a year in salary and bonuses. But we often, the same people pointing finger at the CEOs don't overlook the sports stars and the movie stars. We generally expect people at the top to succeed, big time. So there's kind of a presumption of excess spending on the part of people at top, and I think it's a cultural phenomenon. I think part of it is we all think we're going to be Bill Gates. Either we're going to make a new invention, we're going to get that great job, or for poor people it's a lottery ticket, right? But somehow we're all going to get rich, and so we tolerate as a culture a lot more inequality than Europe does, and other places in there's a rise in non-wage income. So the proportion of total income that's going to salary has been declining. And non-wage income, such as interest income, dividends, and profits have been rising relative to wages. I think that's part of it. I think the dual income families have contributed somewhat to it, and you can see it at the University of Idaho. If you have a dual professor, a professor husband and wife team, for example, they will make anywhere between $150,000 and $300,000 in salary. If you have the same husband and wife team in classified staff, it can range from anywhere from 40 to 75. Right? So you can see that disparity among or that process in effect, even at the U of I, and that it's amplified out in the business world. The tax system, I think, contributes a lot to it. There's a lot of tax loopholes. The top marginal tax rate once stood at 90%. When John F. Kennedy was in office. It's now around 35% today, and it's riddled with loopholes, as is most of the other taxes that we have. It's possible for many traders on Wall Street to actually get capital gains on their daily trades, so they pay 15% marginal tax rate, which I find astonishing. Warren Buffett has pointed that out. Very, very clearly. There's been a decline in unionism and minimum wage laws in the United States. Minimum wage laws have not kept up with inflation. There's been a decline in unionism from about 35% of the workforce in 1950, and it's down to about 12% today. The tax system, the overall tax system is progressive. The income tax is the most progressive. It's interesting when you look at the tax debate among many conservatives. They'll point out accurately that half the American public, or half the American taxpayers, don't pay any income tax. And of course, the indication there is that the poor people don't pay taxes. Actually, don't pay taxes. There's actually proposals out there to increase the taxes on middle income and low income families, which I find interesting. But they leave out the payroll tax, the sales tax, and the property taxes, right? Yeah. And for a lot of poor and middle income people, they pay more payroll taxes than they pay income taxes, right? For people on the lower side. So then trade and globalization is a factor as well, although as both Paul Krugman has pointed out and Peugeot, it's not as big a factor as advertised, because our external sector is one of the lowest in the world. If you take either imports or the combination of imports and exports as a percent of GDP and rank them in the world, we're below 100. You know, so that's often pointed to that the external sector is the primary driver of the skewing of the income distribution, but the facts tend to suggest otherwise. I'd like to point out there are trade-offs in tax and changing the social safety net in the United States. Currently, about 41 cents out of every dollar goes for taxes, state, federal, and local level in the United States. For Great Britain, it's about 57 cents, and for France, it's around 80 cents. And I think, practically speaking, I don't think the United States is ready to move to a European-style safety net. I just don't think that's in the cards. What I would like to see happen is to take a practical approach to fix some of the major problems that we have, primarily healthcare. I'd like to change the tax system so that the really egregious loopholes are closed, and see certain sectors like the education sector become more efficient in the system. There are also trade-offs. There's at least one study that suggests that if you look at European countries compared to the United States, their economic growth has been less proportionally because of the differential in the tax system, although their economic system is more evenly distributed. The final thing I'd like to point out is that under the theory of supply-side economics, it was supposed to lift all boats. One of the concerns I've had over the last couple of decades is that for the bottom 20% of the population, you look at the numbers in real terms, it's hard to say whether or not they're better off or not. It's hard to say that somebody living in 1970 in the bottom 20% of the population, if you look at the numbers, it's really hard to say definitively they're better off. after all these years. And real GDP has risen substantially over that period of time. And I find that a concern. You know, one of the theories of supply-side economics is it was supposed to raise all boats, even if the income distribution was more skewed. And one concern I have is that the bottom 20%, it doesn't seem to have risen